Well, thanks very much, everybody, for coming to this event at IISS Americas for a discussion of North Korea, boom or bust. You'll note the clever play of words there. It can mean various things. Normally, we have a sort of a 30% dropout rate for those who signal attendance. I think today we had a 30% increase in those who are participating. That's a tribute, I think, to our speakers, but also to the issue at hand, which is certainly one of the top security issues facing not just the United States, but the world, and particularly the region. So this event is part of the IISS America's pre-Shangri-La Dialogue series, where now the third such event, we seek to shed light on the issues that come up at the Shangri-La Dialogue, which will be held this weekend in Singapore for the 16th year. The Shangri-La Dialogue is a gathering of defense ministers around the region and many of their counterparts in other countries. There's one Asian defense minister who will not be there. That's the North Korean. I tried many times to get the North Koreans to come to Shangri-La Dialogue, and it's been one of the failures. Every time I have my annual review, I get that checked off as area to improve on. So let's get serious about North Korea. We have four renowned experts to address aspects of the North Korean issue, starting with Victor Cha on my far right, who's a senior advisor and the inaugural holder of the Korea Chair at CSIS. That's another think tank in town. He's also director of Asian Studies and holds the D.S. Song Chair in the Department of Government and School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. From 2004 to 2007, he served as Director for Asian Affairs at the White House on the National Security Council. He's a longtime IISS member and contributor. Sumi Terry, to my immediate right, is BowerGroupAsia's Managing Director for Korea. From 2009 to 2010, she was the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for East Asia at the National Intelligence Council. Before that, she served as Director for Korea, Japan, and Oceanic Affairs at the National Security Council. Earlier, she worked as a senior analyst on Korean affairs at the CIA. I met Sue 3 years ago at a conference in Philadelphia where I was very impressed with her presentation. Ever since, I've wanted her to join us at IISS, and thanks for coming this time. Jihwan Hwang is a professor of international relations at the University of Seoul. Currently, he's on a year-long visiting research scholar at the Catholic University of America. He served in several advisory positions in the Korean government, including the Presidential Committee for Unification, Preparation, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Ministry of Unification. We met for the first time 8 years ago in Hanoi, and our paths have crossed several times since then. And finally is Michael Elleman, IISS Senior Fellow for Missile Defense, based here in Washington. Before I hired Mike in 2009, he spent 5 years at Booz Allen Hamilton, where he supported the implementation of cooperative threat reduction programs in the former Soviet Union. Previous to that, he spent 18 months at the United Nations Monitoring, Verification, and Inspection Commission as a missile expert for weapons inspection missions in Iraq. He writes and speaks extensively about North Korea missile development. The full event will run for an hour and a half. Following remarks by each of the panelists, we'll have a discussion portion, and I'll turn it over to questions for you. This event is on the record. It's being broadcast by C-SPAN 1 and C-SPAN Radio. Additionally, a video will be posted on the IISS website. Because of the C-SPAN broadcast, we have extra lights here, which adds to the heat in the room. And unfortunately, today, the air conditioning chose to go out for the entire building, and the room is packed with people. So I'm going to encourage everyone to feel free to take off one layer of clothing. I encourage the panelists to do that as well, but we've all been mic'd up in our suits, so we're not going to be able to have that luxury. So if you see us sweating, it's not just because we're worried about North Korea. So, Victor, let's start off with some thoughts from you, please.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here in this toasty room with all of you this morning. Mark neglected to mention how we first met. You probably don't remember how we first met. You do remember? So I was doing my PhD dissertation, and I was doing my field research as a Fulbright scholar in Japan and Korea, and looking for people to interview for my thesis. And you know, when you're a PhD student just roaming the streets of Tokyo and Seoul trying to get some government official to talk to you, you're very grateful. You remember the ones who actually said yes. And Mark was one of the two people at the U.S. Embassy who said yes at the time. He was a political officer at the time. And the other was Bill McKinney. I don't know if you remember Bill. He was the defense attaché at the time. So I'm always grateful for that. And thank you. Thank you, Mark. In terms of North Korea, great title, Boom or Bust. If any of you have even been mildly paying attention to the news, you will have noticed an uptick in coverage of North Korea, largely because of the missile testing activity they have been undertaking. Some of you may look at this and think, well, you know, we've seen the North Koreans do this before. This is just cyclical coverage of every time they decide to test another missile or do another nuclear test. But I would put to you that there is a qualitative difference today in terms of what is happening versus what has happened in the past. If we start with some of the basic metrics, between 1994 and 2000 and the end of 2007, so for about 17 years, almost 18 years, North Korea did 17 ballistic missile tests and 1 nuclear test between 1994 and December 2007. Since January of 2008 till today, they've done, I think the number is, if we count this past weekend, 73 or 74 ballistic missile tests and 4 nuclear tests. So there has been a sea change in the amount of testing that they have been doing. In the past, there was a theory bandied about in the policy community in Washington, D.C., and in academic halls around universities that one of the purposes of North Korea's testing was that it was essentially a desire to have negotiations with the outside world, and in particular the United States. North Korea is a poor, small, isolated country. It has the largest country in the world on its border. It's got Russia on its border across the sea, Sea of Japan, East Sea, whichever you prefer, is Japan. The United States military is in the south, and directly across the border in South Korea is a very successful Korea, not a very unsuccessful Korea. And so for all these reasons, the North Korean regime did these tests as essentially a way to try to draw the outside world into negotiations, to get them credibility, to get them legitimacy, because it was the only currency they had. They had no other currency with which to trade with the outside world. I think it's pretty safe to say that there are not that many, there may be a few still, but there are not that many in the policy community that still believe that is the purpose of this testing. The pace of testing clearly suggests that this is a military testing program. It is not simply a cry for help or a provocation disguised as an olive branch. This is a military testing program. So what is the purpose of this program? Well, clearly one purpose is survival, right? Every regime seeks survival, and dictatorships in particular are quite often very much focused on their survival. But I would put to you that a regime that over the past 25 years has devoted a disproportionate amount of its national resources to a WMD program is doing this not simply for reasons of survival. Right? North Korea is demonstrating and actively trying to test a capability that can reach the United States with a nuclear-tipped ICBM. We can certainly talk about, I'm sure Michael can talk about some of the obstacles that still remain from them from doing that, but that's clearly the objective of all of this testing. The purpose of being able to reach the United States with an ICBM, the west coast of the United States, and to be able to threaten all of Japan and South Korea. The military objective of all this is, in my view, they want to try to undercut the credibility of U.S. extended deterrence guarantees to South Korea. In their own minds, I'm not saying U.S., but in North Korean minds, they believe that if they can threaten the United States, if they can threaten Los Angeles or San Francisco with a nuclear attack, it will create hesitation on the part of the United States if they were called on defending South Korea. If they can threaten all U.S. installations and cities in Japan, including Tokyo, they will create, in their own minds, some hesitation on the part of Japan to allow the United States to flow forces through Japanese logistics nodes in defense of the Korean Peninsula. You have to remember that in North Korea, the world for North Korea is very small. Right? It's about survival, of course, but North Koreans don't really care about climate change. Right? They don't really care about global governance. They don't really care about responsible overseas development assistance policies in Africa. Right? They don't really care about fragile and conflict-afflicted states. They don't really care about, the only thing they care about is their survival and dominance of the Korean Peninsula. Those are the only two things that they care about. So while this idea, this theory I'm putting forward may seem far-fetched to some of you, if you look at it from a North Korean mindset, this is all that matters. Because once they can create some sense of hesitation or doubt in South Korean minds that the United States or Japan would be there in the case of a conflict, then they will feel they will have affected the strategic balance on the peninsula. Right? 25 years ago, the North Korean regime realized they were never going to be able to match South Korea dollar for dollar, right? Company for company, tank for tank, soldier for soldier. So they chose an asymmetric strategy focused on nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, and cyber, right, as a way to try to match, asymmetrically try to match what is happening on the other side of the peninsula. And that is essentially the strategy that they've been following. In terms of, I don't know, Mark, how long do you want me to speak for?
It should be no more than 10, so you're kind of getting toward the conclusion, I think.
Okay. I think, let me make some comments about the new government in South Korea. As you know, new government was elected in South Korea, what was it, last week, a couple of weeks ago? And I think there was a lot of noise in the press about how, this is the first progressive government in South Korea in a decade, that they're going to take a very different view of policy towards North Korea and create a rift in the alliance between the United States and South Korea. I think what we've seen thus far actually has shown the opposite, which is that President Moon appears to have taken a pretty measured position when it comes to engagement with North Korea, reinvigorating the so-called sunshine policy. Of course, the North Koreans have helped in creating this measured response because they've already done 2 missile tests since the new South Korean president was elected. And I think from a U.S. perspective, in principle, I think the United States doesn't have a problem with engagement with North Korea, but it has to be done at the right time. It has to be coordinated and done at the right time, which is what the South Koreans want as well. I mean, the South Koreans don't want to throw money down a black hole. If they're going to invest in engagement, they want it to be effective. And it's not going to be effective if it's not coordinated with the United States and other members who are involved in trying to denuclearize North Korea. So thus far, I think the media speculation was a little bit speculative. Of course, they have to sell newspapers, so that's a better story when you say the U.S. and South Korea are going in opposite directions. But thus far, I think if you look at President Moon's statements, they seem to have been quite measured reflecting realities on the ground rather than some ideologically blue sky view of what engagement can do with a regime that, as I have said, since January of 2009, January 2008 has clearly been on the testing warpath. So why don't I stop?
Okay, thanks very much, Victor, for laying out the situation and some views about the new South Korean government, which Dr. Hwang is also going to comment on. But first of all, Sue, you've been looking at the North Korean case for quite a number of years. Tell us some of your insights, please.
When I used to work at the CIA, I spent about a decade looking at North Korean internal situation. And I'll tell you, most definitively, the hard part that it's to get a clear understanding on is leadership dynamics, regime intentions, what the leaders are going to do. This is something that's really hard to get a clarity on. Very, very difficult. But as Victor said, eventually we got a handle on the Kim Jong-il leadership, the decision-making process, and Kim Il-sung too. But Kim Jong-il, and what Victor referred to, we got a handle on this Brinksmanship tactics policy. We called it a pattern. We called it a cycle, provoke get paid cycle, Pyongyang's playbook. We had cute little names for it, which was basically North Korea would do something provocative, and there was international condemnation. They were up the ante, and then they were sort of pivot to some sort of peace offensive. There was some sort of off-ramp, which then would lead to some sort of a dialogue and negotiation, and then some sort of concessions made by Washington or Seoul to North Korea. This is not exactly the pattern under the Kim Jong-un leadership. He's not following this exact pattern. He seems to be bent on really perfecting and completing the nuclear program. He staked his entire legitimacy on perfecting this nuclear arsenal that his father and grandfather have pursued at a cost of billions of dollars and millions of lives. But he's bent on it. He's bent on completing it. And because he sees achieving this capability to be able to hit United States, Washington, D.C., or New York with nuclear-tipped ICBM as the final deterrent, final guarantee. So I don't think there is any. So what really concerns me is, we didn't get to talk a lot about policy, but maybe we'll get to that. Is that, and I'm, whether you're for maximum pressure or for engagement, and I happen to be for pressure. I happen to be, that's my preference in terms of maximum amount of sanctions, additional sanctions, going after secondary sanctions if necessary, and other measures to try to get the Kim regime to change its calculus. But what really concerns me, since we're going to be frank here, is that none of these measures were likely might not achieve the desire that we want to achieve, the goal that we want to achieve, which is to get North Korea to give up nuclear weapons, to give up its nuclear arsenal. And so whatever we do, we're sooner or later, I think sooner rather than later, we'll probably get there, or North Korea will achieve that capability. And then I have many concerns, obviously, once North Korea achieves that capability. But the two main concerns that I have are, first, and I think Victor has also referred to this many times, is strategic miscalculation really will go up by the Kim regime once he believes that he has this capability, that you can hold U.S. cities as hostage, basically hold it as hostage, that his decision-making or mindset, it could be that he thinks now he has this ability to really deter us, which then will lead to, it could be more provocative, conventional acts of coercion. They will, of course, then lead to unintended escalation. They will lead to more, obviously, a problem. So that's one concern I have. Second concern, and I know a lot of folks share this concern, is that nuclear deterrence has worked thus far. Like it worked with North Korea. Deterrence worked. Deterrence and containment policy worked. But again, I'm just not as confident under this leadership that nuclear deterrence and containment policy will necessarily work with Kim Jong-un. I just have less confidence that it will work. And people like Jeffrey Lewis wrote a very scary foreign policy piece about how North Korea might be even developing offensive nuclear doctrine. I'm not sure if I could go as far as that, but there is an argument that people are making that, that there is a possibility that Kim Jong-un could do that, could use even nuclear weapons in an effort to really recoil U.S. and South Korea in case that he thinks to stop us from invading or going after North Korea. Because when he saw cases like in Iraq and Libya with Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi, obviously conventional forces did not work. So that we cannot rule out that possibility. And so obviously that is a very scary scenario. Oh, it's been 6 minutes. Wow. Okay. So the Trump administration apparently told the visiting South Korean delegation recently that there's a 4-point strategy with what they're doing. 1, not recognizing North Korea as a nuclear state. 2, imposing all available possible sanctions on North Korea. 3, not seeking regime change. And 4, ultimately resolving the issue with dialogue. This sounds all good, but I do think that we have to be somewhat also realistic. We have to be prepared for this scenario that none of these measures are going to work. And what is our long-term policy? What is our long-term goal? I don't know if we have that. And I know some people are tired of it. I know I'm always talking about unification and so on. But, I mean, we say regime change is off the table because it's sort of not fashionable to say that. But, I mean, where's our end state? Because if this is credible that it's not going to change, you're not going to go anywhere with this North Korean, this particular regime. I mean, this is something that I think we do have to think about. Just 2 points, since I'm out of time, I want to talk about is on the elites. The sanctions measure in all this, it's not only to pressure North Korea. I do think that it does help in terms of undermining the current regime state. So if you are seeking for sort of you're hoping to create instability or regime change scenario in North Korea. Sanctions and applying that kind of trying to really, because you're taking money away from the elites for Kim Jong-un's ability to underwrite the lifestyle of the elites. And I do think, this information penetration campaign that we often talk about is very important, but I just want to make this final point that it shouldn't only be targeted towards the public, the populace of getting information into North Korea. I think we should definitely try to, again, target the elites because we're trying to get 2 messages across to the elites, which is that this current course of trying to attain nuclear weapons and not give it up, this is not going to guarantee your survival and livelihood. And secondly, if you are able to get out of North Korea or try to defect, that there will be maybe some sort of amnesty or some sort of a lifestyle that could be guaranteed to elites. Because again, I do think fundamentally, because it's the elite supports that's keeping the regime going. But why don't I just wrap up?
Okay, no, you ended on a very good place. It reminds me of what my friend Tae-Yong Ho talks about. It'd be great if we can get him to Washington too. So, Professor Hwang, please, a view from South Korea, not representing South Korea, of course.
Okay, thank you for having me. Here, my name is Jihwan. I teach in the University of Seoul, but now at the Elleman, the visiting research scholar at the Catholic University. So I think I was wondering why the Mark decided on the title of this seminar, the North Korea boom or bust. I'm sure that's now boom because there are so many people here. So you are, very interested in the North Korean issues. He actually asked me to talk about the South Korean perspective on the North Korean nuclear issue. But unfortunately, I'm not a government official. So, but anyway, I know a lot of people inside the Korean government. I have many friends inside the Moon Jae-in, the new South Korean government, Moon Jae-in. So I think I understand very well about the South Korean government, North Korean policy. Basically, I believe that, as most of us do, that the Moon Jae-in government North Korea policy is, somewhat different from those of the previous conservative, the government, the Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye. Because the Moon Jae-in government basically, emphasizes the importance of the inter-Korean, relations, including the economic cooperation and also the social and the cultural exchange between the two Koreas. So think the Moon government will start with the North Korean policy with the cultural or the social, the approach rather than the political or the military one. But it seems to me that, however, I think that it's very difficult to say the new government, Moon Jae-in government, the real policy, the real North Korea policy would be completely and fundamentally different from the previous government. So I would say the three different variables to explain the North Korea policy. The first one is South Korea's domestic politics, and also the second one is reaction dynamics on the Korean peninsula, and the third one is the alliance politics, of course, the alliance between the U.S. and South Korea. The first, regarding the Korean domestic politics, as you know that because we have now the new, the progressive, the president in South Korea, so it's natural to expect the new North Korea policy by the new South Korean government. So the Moon's policy will definitely reflect the former Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, the policy toward North Korea, which is widely known as the Sunshine policy. So many people predict that the President Moon's policy would be the Moonshine policy, maybe. So maybe. But so in this sense, recently the South Korean government, especially the Ministry of Unification, approved the South Korea's NGOs, the humanitarian aid to North Korea maybe 2 days ago, and the new foreign minister nominee, the Kang Kyung-hwa, maybe you know her, who used to work for the UN, and maybe the UN, the Secretary General, once told the press that it is necessary to continue the humanitarian aid towards North Korea in any case. And she also said that it is UN's basic principle. So maybe most of you know the Professor Moon Jung-il at Yonsei University. Now he is your president, Moon Jae-in's special security advisor. He is the strong supporter of Sunshine policy. He has a book on Sunshine policy published in 2013. The title is The Sunshine Policy in Defense of Engagement as a Path to Peace in Korea. And also Professor Kim Ki-jung, who is now the president of the National Security Advisor and also the professor at the Yonsei University. He was here in Washington, D.C. to explain the Moon Jae-in the government, the North Korea policy and foreign policy maybe several months ago. And he's also a strong supporter of the Sunshine policy on the Korean peninsula. And finally, Seo-hoon, you may or may not know him, he's a National Intelligence Service, the South Korea's CIA, as a director nominee. He has also had been deeply involved in the inter-Korean negotiation and relation during the Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun government. So all of them believe that sanctions are not enough to change the North Korea's course of action, and they want to pursue a new North Korea policy that will change the real nature of the North Korean regime and society maybe in a longer term perspective. But however, I think that it is somewhat difficult to conduct a fundamentally different North Korea policy, even during the Moon Jae-in government. The first reason is that the action-reaction dynamics on inter-Korean relations. So South Korea's North Korea policy is influenced by the North Korea's external behavior, as well as the South Korea's domestic politics. So because North Korea has conducted 5 nuclear tests for the last 10 years and maybe hundreds of missile tests. So it is somewhat difficult to initiate a completely new policy except the humanitarian aid. So if the North Korea regime, does not reciprocate South Korea's conciliatory policy, then there will be less room for a new policy, even for the Moon Jae-in government. So, in this sense, North Korea's external behavior is really important, but the Kim Jong-un regime is less likely to stop those provocative actions. So now mostly the South Korean people feel very threatened by North Korea's Pyongyang's military provocation. So the most Korean people support the international sanction on North Korea and believe that China has not fully cooperating in implementing the sanctions, maybe near the China-North Korea borderline. So if North Korea continues its provocative behavior, the South Korea's public opinion, will be less likely to support the new engagement. So, and third, the alliance politics also here between the U.S. and South Korea. The Moon Jae-in government, understand the importance of the Korea-U.S. alliance in dealing with the North Korean nuclear crisis. So President Moon spoke. Do I have maybe 1 2 minutes? No? Okay. The President Moon also spoke several times about the importance of Korea-U.S. Alliance and also talked about the need to, keep strengthening the alliance. So I think the Moon Jae-in government will keep cooperating with the United States in responding to North Korean nuclear crisis. But what the South Korean people are concerned now is about the uncertainty and the unpredictability on in the North Korean nuclear issue, and also the Trump administration's policy toward North Korea. While Americans are concerned about the new South Korean government and its North Korea policy, but the South Koreans are concerned about the Trump administration's foreign policy and North Korea policy. As opposed to the Bush and the Obama administration's policy toward North Korea, the Trump administration, the North Korea policy appears, even to me, is very uncertain and unpredictable. So, which makes South Korean people really concerned about the possibility of Trump's Korea passing, actually. So when President Trump says that North Korea has shown great disrespect for their neighbor China, and China is trying hard, honestly speaking, the South Korean people do not understand what he really means. And also, he also said that North Korea is maybe more important than better trade deal with China. Does it mean that? The South Korean people do not understand what he really means. So this is why the South Korean people are concerned about the possibility of U.S.-China, maybe U.S.-China grand bargain on the North Korean issue, and maybe the Korea passing also, which will not represent the South Korea's security and interests. So I believe that U.S. and North Korea will still believe that they continues a critical role in resolving the North Korean nuclear issue, but it is still very necessary, to resolve the uncertainty and unpredictability between the two. So it's really important, to cooperate and coordinate, very closely between these U.S. and South Korea, two countries. So let me stop here.
Okay, thanks very much. Some very interesting observations there we want to get into, I think, about this concern in South Korea over statements. Mike, I put you last because I knew that you would enlighten us even more about the North Korean missile capabilities and some ideas on dealing with it.
Okay, thank you, Mark. As my co-panelist, Dr. Cha, discussed earlier, missiles play a kind of a paramount role in North Korea's statecraft and its means to ensure its survival. It's probably their preferred means for delivering a nuclear weapon. Missiles also have a conventional capability, and in principle, they could arm the missiles with chemical or biological weapons, though I would argue that artillery is a much more effective means for delivering the two biological or chemical agent, and they can range Seoul quite easily that way. I wouldn't expect them to use missiles to deliver WMD other than nuclear. Now, in the headlines over the last 3-4 years, or since Kim Jong-un has certainly come to power, we've seen North Korea conduct a large number of missile tests. I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 to 78. It depends on how you count them, and some of the news reports are a little bit ambiguous. But nonetheless, there are reasons North Korea would want to test its missiles. Primarily, at least under the Kim Jong-un regime, we see them trying to develop new systems. You can't develop a new missile without testing it and testing it extensively. It typically takes 2 to 5 years to develop a new system. That includes the flight trial portion of the development phase. You could certainly shorten that period, and I wouldn't be surprised if North Korea tries to shorten it to a year or 2 or 3. But there are inherent risks to doing so, and I'll attempt to address some of those risks in a bit. Flight tests also provide North Korea a means to train its launch crews for maintaining operational readiness. You can use them to kind of survey your stockpile to make sure that as they age, they still perform to specifications. And this is actually an important role of flight testing in the U.S. and Russian programs, or Soviet programs in the past. Now, missile tests can also be performed to deter rivals, to achieve some political or diplomatic messaging, coercion, intimidation, as Victor said, creating leverage for negotiations. We've seen them do this in the past. And when we look back at the Kim Il-sung and the Kim Jong-il regimes, we see that the missile testing was done, it seems, primarily for political to reach political objectives, as opposed to some technical imperatives, such as developing new systems. Now, it's interesting if we, again, examine the history, and I think previous speakers have talked about this, but, under the Kim Il-sung regime, they tested 15 missiles, or 1.5 missiles per year after 1984. Under Kim Jong-il, it was 16 missiles, or 1 missile per year, and those came in bunches. I mean, with the exception of one test, they either occurred in 2006 or 2009. And as I mentioned, obviously the 2006 test, I think they launched 7 missiles in the course of a few hours, and they were trying to achieve clearly a political message, and it wasn't done for any technical purposes. When Kim Jong-un came to power, things changed dramatically. They said they're now averaging about 13 to 15 tests per year, and this is indicative of missile development programs. And in fact, North Korea is pursuing the development of more than one system. I lose track of them because they seem to introduce something new each day. But I want to try and talk a little bit about their capabilities, where they are, and then project some timelines, and maybe at the end offer some, not policy prescriptions, but some ideas about what we could, or and the limitations we have in trying to halt missile development. Now, the Scud and Nodong technologies, or missiles, were established during the Kim Il-sung regime. There was virtually no flight testing. I mean, I think they conducted a handful of tests, which is indicative of having received the technology from a foreign source. In this case, it was very likely Russia, and to be more specific, the Mikheyev Design Bureau and elements attached to Mikheyev. More recently, what we've seen North Korea do is leverage that existing Scud technology. You recall that last year they tested what is called the Scud ER for extended range. This is a Scud that was modified. They changed the materials of construction to lighten it and increase the diameter from 0.88 meters to 1 meter. And this allows it to travel about 1,000 kilometers. it is an old Soviet design. It's a little unclear whether North Korea developed this themselves or they just this was imported during the 90s with all the other technologies they received. But why the Scud-ER? You know, a 1,000-kilometer missile, it essentially matches the performance of a Nodon. It seems in the way they tested it, where they took what we call very steep or lofted trajectories, it was aimed at messaging to South Korea that we can overfly your THAAD missile defense battery. We have options to counter your missile defense capabilities. And then more recently, and in fact, they unveiled it during the military parade on April 15th, and then they apparently tested it over the weekend. It's a Scud with, it appears to be a Scud-C with a new reentry vehicle, one that can maneuver. This could serve two purposes. Maneuvering when it's in the atmosphere would help would complicate or compromise the performance of Patriot missile defenses, but you could also achieve much better accuracy and make your conventional weaponry, conventionally armed missiles, more militarily effective. Now, North Korea has been quite ingenious in leveraging the Scud technology to create a satellite launcher, commonly called the Unha. I think it goes by other names. It's like most development programs, it failed its first 3 or 4 launch attempts. It succeeded in the last 2 in placing something into orbit, but the object placed in the orbit apparently has never really worked. So they have a ways to go. The concern with this satellite launcher is that it could be used as a stepping stone to creating an ICBM, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Over the course of the last 2 years, we've seen several surprising developments, and the one that surprised me the most was the emergence of this two-stage solid propellant missile called the Pukguksong-1. It's launched from a submarine, which provides it additional retaliatory capability, if you will. But all the missiles that the North Koreans had relied on in the past have been liquid-based, liquid fuel. This is a solid fuel system. It appears, at least from what I've been able to gather, these are developed indigenously. This is the first, again. This missile can cover 1,200 kilometers, so the submarine can patrol relative distance from North Korea, or from the Korean Peninsula. But I would argue also that just a few tests doesn't mean they have the capability. Right now they have a single submarine. They're going to have to develop at least 3. I think there's an old saying in the Navy, if you have 1 ship, you have none, because they're not always out on patrol. And so you have to do rotation. So they're going to have at a minimum, 3 submarines, probably 6, to maintain a reliable retaliatory capacity. They also have to do a number of other things, like develop concepts of operation. Where are they going to patrol the subs? How are they going to protect them? Command and control, communication is another key element. I don't think they're going to patrol very far from the peninsula, but if they want to do, they're going to have to develop that capacity. So I don't see that emerging quickly. Real quick, the Pukguksong-2 is a land-based version. It's on a tracked vehicle. The more interesting development from a long-range missile capability is the Musadon. It's failed 6 or 7 times in its first 8 launches. Number of possibilities for why that is. More recently, they tested the Hwasong-12. This was 2 weeks ago. It is an intermediate range missile. The source, the engine that's being used for this is a mystery. But it's it's the most troubling thing that I have seen come out of North Korea, because this is a true stepping stone towards an ICBM. Real quick, 3 ways to get to an ICBM. The quickest would be to convert the Unha launcher. This would be an immobile system. It would be very vulnerable to pre-launch. It would still take some modifications and flight tests as a missile. It could be ready for emergency use 2018, 2019, but I think it would just be an interim step. They could rely on Musadon or this HS-12 technology to create an intermediate range system. They would have to prove out the intermediate range missile first before they would want to go to step up. though we've seen them take shortcuts in the past. They could achieve a road mobile system based on these technologies sometime 2020, 2021. The more distant prospect is the use of solid propellants that we've seen in the Puketsang missiles, but that is, I would be shocked if a missile would be operationally viable by 2015, or 2025, it's more likely 2030. Policy options are very limited. I would just sum what I have here. We can talk about it a little in the question and answer. We treat all missile tests the same, and I think that's wrong. When they test a Scud, we should probably ignore it for practical purposes. The test of this intermediate range system was a big deal, yet our response to it has been the same as it is for every other missile, and I would like to see some more thought go into how to respond to individual tests. And the development of this intermediate range system is a lot more consequential than even the flight test of the Hwang. So I'll stop there. And sorry for going over time as usual.
Well, you had a lot to cover there, Mike. The more systems they develop, the more time I need to give you. So there's a lot on the table here. There's a lot of policy options to discuss. We can discuss a lot about capabilities. We can discuss intentions, which I thought it was fascinating, Sue, when you talked about how it was difficult to get a track on it, and then you got it, and then they changed the intentions. We're going to go into a Q&A session here for about 35 minutes. The usual pattern, when you're called upon, state your name and affiliation, and make it quick and witty if you can, but solid is more important even than witty. So here in the third row, I'm going to call in two people here at once because there's going to be a lot of questions. We're going to take two at a time. In the blue shirt, and then Greg in the white shirt. Blue shirt first. Take the mic. Speak into the mic.
Hi, my name's Ken Rosenberg, and I'm unaffiliated free agent. Perhaps Professor Hwang would like to respond to this question, but any of the panel members are welcome to. I'm wondering what the prospects are for the new regime in South Korea to take such measures as reopening the Kaesong industrial complex, or family reunions, or humanitarian aid, such measures, or any other reaching out.
Okay, hold that question, and we'll get back to you. We'll let Greg Thielman pose a question, and hopefully we won't have the same. No, we are getting the same feedback.
Greg Thielman, board of the Arms Control Association. I think my question is mostly to Asumi Terry on the basis of some of the comments you made about your deepest concerns about Kim Jong-un's behavior. Could you elaborate a little bit on the scenario you fear? Because I'm having trouble imagining that Kim Jong-un could think that he could use any significant use of military force against South Korea, which would involve tens of thousands of American servicemen, without thinking that the United States would attack North Korea in response to a brutal fashion that would result in his demise.
Okay, good question, Greg. Let's go to Professor Hwang to address the options for Kaesong reopening and family reunions and the like.
Okay, thank you for your great question. So as I said, that right now it's very difficult to reopen the Kaesong Industrial Park because right now I think that the Moon Jae-in government will focus on starting the social cultural exchange first, and then economic cooperation, and then maybe political and military issues. So family reunion definitely, I think that the Moon government will start maybe foreseeable future, maybe this year or the next year. Maybe the humanitarian, they already told about the humanitarian aid, so definitely. But Kaesong Industrial the complex is a difficult issue because it also involved in maybe the international sanction issue also. So rather than the Kaesong Industrial Park, I think that the Gyeonggang Mountain tourism is the candidate for the next the policy after the the humanitarian aid and the family reunion. So the first, the social cultural exchange, and the second, the economic cooperation, and maybe the third and fourth is the political and the military.
I want to ask a follow-on question here. Some of this, the various forms of interaction with North Korea that are being talked about seem to be in direct contradiction to the U.S. policy of isolation. Isolation politically, isolation economically. Kaesong Industrial Zone might be in violation even of the Security Council resolution sanctions. So I'm wondering, is there a recognition in South Korea that such initiatives are going to run smack up against U.S. policy? And maybe Victor or Sum, if you want to weigh in on this, how is this going to be seen in Washington?
Maybe the many officials in Moon government will, like to reopen the gas industrial park, but as I said, that they also, they think much about the U.S.-Korea relation, and also the U.S. foreign policy towards North Korea. So, they're concerned about whether it will, complicate the international sanction on North Korea.
Okay, Victor, and then Sue, and then when you answer, Sue, you can also address Greg's question.
Well, I think the tip of the spear of any engagement policy by the South Korean government is going to start with food and fertilizer. That usually happens at a certain time of the year. We may be past that point now in terms of, well, food is, food you can give all year round. Fertilizer, maybe not so much. The other thing I think Kaesong right now is, is kind of off limits, because if the South Korean government were to reopen Kaesong, it would be a violation of standing sanctions, including UN Security Council sanctions. So that's really off the table for now. There may be so we collect a lot of data at CSIS on North Korean provocations and behavior, and for what it's worth, we predicted accurately that North Korea would do kinetic provocations, bracketing the South Korean elections. No one cares later that you got it right before, but I'm just telling you we got it right.
Beyond parallel.
Yeah, beyond parallel. Yeah, but our data actually doesn't really suggest they're driving forces for more North Korean provocations coming up over the summer. Actually, usually what happens is North Korea enters a peace offensive period that starts from about June 25th, which is the anniversary of the Korean War, going till about August 15th, which is Liberation Day in South Korea. And it sort of stops around August 15th because they have to get ready to get angry at the annual U.S. ROK military exercises that start at the end of August. So conceivably there could be a period there in the summer where there might be some opportunity for some of these social and cultural things, but I think I think it gets harder when you start talking about big projects like Kaesong or even Kumgang, the Diamond Mountain project. I think it becomes much harder just because, so I was in government the last time the progressives in South Korea were in power. Sue was in government at the same time, and I think even those people who are the strongest advocates of engagement understand that 2007 is a different North Korea than the North Korea we're dealing with today. It was a different leadership, as Sue said, and their behavior is very different. There's a common misperception out there that if we just talk to the North Koreans, maybe they'll calm down. What has become very clear under Kim Jong-un, under the current leadership, is that the North Korean government has no interest in talking to anybody. If you look at their behavior since January of 2008, there has been absolutely no interest in talking to the United States, to Japan, to South Korea, to China, to Russia. Again, we collect data at CSIS on China, DPRK, high-level interactions. And this particular period that we're in now, in terms of the average annual frequency of high-level interactions between China and DPRK, is the lowest ever, right? And we all know this because there's been no summit between Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping. But what we also found was the reason for the low level of interaction is not because the Chinese are pissed off at the North Koreans. I mean, they are pissed off at the North Koreans, but That's not the reason there's no high level. The reason is the North Koreans don't want to talk to the Chinese. The Chinese, I think, have been trying very hard to talk to the North Koreans, and it's the North Koreans that have been denying all contact. So again, I think while there are many from the previous progressive government that will be or are in the new government, I think there are new realities on the ground, and I think they also understand that it's a different North Korea than it was in 2004, 5, 6, 7.
Thanks very much, Victor. Before I come to you, so I just want to repeat Greg's question because apparently the mic wasn't working. So his question was, why would North Korea think that the United States would not get involved in a conflict given the tripwire function of U.S. forces in South Korea who would be involved immediately in any attack on South Korea?
Let me just address the South Korea part, which I think Victor answered very comprehensively. I do think there's degrees of engagement. They can try, fill it out. The Kaesong Industrial Complex is just a very difficult one, and it knows it's going to be completely at odds with Washington, just because it is in violation of United States sanctions, because you can't guarantee where the money is going from there. My recommendation for the Moon administration when he comes next month for the summit with Mr. Trump is sort of not try to address these any of the thorny issues. We're asking for clarification. And did you mean it when you say we should pay for that deployment and so on? Just focus on trying to establish a rapport, a connection, because obviously for Mr. Trump that personal connection is important, as we've seen with Prime Minister Abe and Xi Jinping and how that could have gone well. But when the Australian Prime Minister tried to seek clarification on accepting refugees, that didn't go well. So that will be the thing. But I really hope that Victor is right, that the Moon administration does not, that after the initial talk, that they're not trying to reopen Kaesong or so, because that would just really be at odds. Now, in terms of your question, I don't think it's a likely scenario that Kim Jong-un is trying to attack United States with a nuclear weapon or South Korea. It's just that there were many times when you have a conventional acts, right? They were thinking of Cheonan in 2010. That could always escalate when you think you have this deterrence, ultimate deterrent capability. And I think this is a last resort if he miscalculates and thinks that we are about to attack. And you never know. Initially, when the Trump administration was a lot of heated rhetoric earlier on, remember all the media there was hysteria when he said we've sent powerful armada to the sea and so on. So if there's any kind of miscalculation that Kim Jong-un thinks that we are about to do something, I think then that would trigger that for him, because he doesn't want the Saddam Hussein fate. He doesn't want Gaddafi fate. That did not work for them. So the idea is that they will strike first if there's going to be a war at all. And so that's the concern, not that it's any kind of likely scenario that we should be worried about.
Okay, thanks very much. That was a good explanation. So we got, 10 different people here. Let's get a couple. Let's go to the third row here, the young lady, and then up in the front here. We'll take these two questions. And just speak loudly, and then I'm going to repeat the question.
Hi, my name is Angela, and I'm from the University of Southern California. My question is mainly directed for Dr. Paul, although it's you mentioned that North Korea hopes to undermine relations between South Korea and the United States and Japan in the hopes of dominating the peninsula. And I just wanted to ask how North Korea views China in the grand scheme of its goals, and if there's any way that U.S.-China relations can play in the North Korean development.
So the question from Angela was basically how to Victor, how to view the China factor in this North Korean desire for dominance in the Korean peninsula.
There are two responses.
Wait, I'm sorry.
We're going to take two at once.
Take two.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Sure. My name is Bob Peters. I'm at National Defense University. My question is, as the ROCs pursue kill chain and KMPR capabilities, particularly as they build up their cruise and ballistic missile capabilities, do they understand that in order to make those capabilities effective and to make that doctrine effective, they need an indigenous overhead air breathing ISR capability and a lot of it? Otherwise, they're going to be reliant upon CFC providing them with the intel in order to execute those doctrines, which is dicey. And so, do they understand those kind of intel requirements?
Okay, so Bob Peters asked a question with some acronyms that I didn't fully all get, but the basic point was, does South Korea understand that as it develops its kill chain missile defense systems that they are going to need air breathing intelligence requirements that they don't now have. So that's probably a question for Professor Hwang, but Mike, if you have any thoughts on that. Let's first go to Victor to answer the first question on China.
The China DPRK relationship is quite bad right now. It is after normalization of relations between China and South Korea in 1992. No North Korean leader, well, there was only one, but no North Korean leader went to China for a decade because they were so upset with it all. You sort of a reemergence, a renaissance, if you will, in the relationship in 2008, 2009, largely because the Chinese signed a bunch of extractive industry contracts with North Korea, so they're taking a lot of minerals and stuff out of North Korea now. But this was not a relationship where they kind of liked each other. They actually both hate each other. I mean, the North Koreans feel like the Chinese treat them like a poor province, which they do. And the Chinese feel like North Korea, every time North Korea does something bad, China's name gets dragged through the mud, so they don't like it either. So, but it's a mutual hostage situation. They're stuck with each other. I think North Korea leverages that greatly to their advantage. They know that China will never allow North Korea to collapse. They know that. And so they are willing to push the envelope as far as they can. And that creates problems for the United States because the United States has a policy right now that's aimed at treating China as part of the solution, which is that, if 85% of North Korea's external trade is with China, we can go after slave labor exports or all these other sorts of things, but if 85% of their trade is with China, China is part of the solution in terms of cutting that trade down, putting economic pressure on North Korea. But the problem is, China is never going to put a truly pressing amount of economic squeeze on North Korea because for fear that they will collapse the regime. The Chinese ambassador himself had an op-ed in USA Today, two weeks ago, where he essentially said that China is willing to put some pressure on, but is afraid if it puts too much pressure on, it will collapse the regime. That is music to North Korea's ears, right? That is music to their ears, and so that's kind of the box that we're caught in. Right now.
Thanks, Victor, and I like the mutual hostage situation. Somebody might want to tweet that. Jihwan, a question to you about.
So I'm not really familiar with those acronyms like Mark does, but I'm not an expert on the defense policy. But if you're from the National Defense University, there's one guy from the Qaeda there, IISS. His name is, sorry,
no, he's done all for me.
Yeah. But as far as I understand that, the Moon Jae-in government's defense policy is not clear yet, actually. So there is more room for the U.S. and South Korea to coordinate on that issue. But mostly the Korean people, including me, are not really sure about the South Korea's KAMD and kill chain capabilities. So but we are also concerned about how we, coordinate with the United States on these issues because, it's natural that the South Korean government try to develop its own, capability for that issue. But the second one is that Moon Jae-in government is, strongly stresses on the importance of the diplomatic terms in understanding its security rather than military terms, as opposed to the former Park Geun-hye and the Im Young-baek government. So the national security advisor now is from the diplomat, while the former Park Geun-hye, the national security advisor, was from the military sectors. So.
I'm going to follow up on your question to Mike because in terms of technical capabilities, you mentioned that one purpose of the lofting the extended range Scud was to send a signal that THAAD won't be able to deal with such a high trajectory. If you have anything to say to Bob on the other point, but on this point too, does THAAD now become irrelevant?
No. I should explain it more fully, but there are targets that lie south of the THAAD battery that may be vulnerable if you can overfly the reach of the THAAD interceptors. maximums or the ceiling of engagement for the THAAD batteries. I've heard 150 kilometers. I've heard 250 kilometers. It probably lies somewhere in between those two. But certainly to attack, say, Busan, it would be vulnerable to highly lofted trajectories of the Scud-ER, but not necessarily Scud-C or Scud-D. I agree with your premise that airborne ISR is essential for kill chain. For those who are not aware, kill chain is the Republic of Korea's strategy for defeating, the ballistic missile forces of North Korea. Pre-launch, pre-assembly. I mean, it goes from birth till land somewhere. Yeah, birth to death. We have the experience from the Gulf War in 1991, where we had, relative to today, our airborne reconnaissance and intelligence gathering capabilities were very poor, and we were unable to interdict Iraq's Scud launchers during that war, even though we had air superiority and everything. In North Korea, the job's a little bit easier, because most of the launchers can't stray too far from the roads. There's a limited number of paved and resurfaced roads in North Korea. So with extensive use of UAVs, maybe a few manned aircraft, overhead satellites, you, I think, have a pretty decent chance of doing interdiction, or at least disrupting operations on the ground for the North Koreans. And that would be essential. But the two elements that are required are the ISR and communicate. Communications is not a simple thing. It's what distinguishes American missile defense from others.
And ISR, I know this, but everybody doesn't know it.
Sorry.
So what does it mean again?
Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. I guess it's a catch-all phrase for knowing what's happening on the ground.
Okay, good, thanks. A couple more questions. I'm going to take the last two in the back there. The gentleman in there, and then Stanley. Just speak loudly so I can hear.
Brian Collins from the Ohio State University, and my question is for Dr. Terry. Completely agree with your analysis that Kim Jong-un is likely undeterrable in his goal to get nuclear capability, deliverable capability. And you therefore say that you believe our best policy is go all out sanctions, or as far as we can with sanctions, tighten the screw. My question, though, two parts to the question. Part A, if he really is undeterrable, I think you're right, what do we then achieve in sanctions? Is it possibly regime change, or is it that we do our darndest, our best to erode North Korean capability? Part two is, what risks do we run if he really is undeterrable, and if sanctions won't do the job, do we end up looking like a paper tiger? The other risk potentially is that we're really destabilizing the situation. Are we destabilizing the situation? So I'd like to react to that.
Okay, thanks, Brian. I'm going to repeat that after Stanley poses his question. I'll repeat both of them then.
Affiliation. It's a very related question to as well, and it's on regime change. I'm not sure if I heard you correctly or interpreted you correctly, but seriously, it's a very important point that the U.S. policy may well fail, as well as our allies' policy fail, saying that deterrence may not work for the horrible situation in terms of threat to our security, and don't we have to think about regime change? One, I want to, if I interpret it right, I don't want to put those words in your mouth. But second, do is that you believe that any country, U.S., ROK, can sign up has the capacity to affect regime change and the reactivity, or what you get, is something globally we do regime change.
Right.
Okay, thanks. That was great. I don't know if you coordinated those questions, but very well coordinated. So, Brian from Ohio State University, these questions are both to Sue Terry. You said Kim Jong-un is likely undeterrable in his quest to get nuclear capability. But you said that the best policy is sanctions. That's not quite what you said, but if he understood you right, what are the sanctions? What is the purpose then? Is it for regime change? And what are the risks in this? Do we look like a paper tiger if it fails? Stanley also asked the question about regime change, Stanley Roth. Do we have the ability to pursue regime change? Do you believe any of the countries, United States, China, or Russia, have a capability? Do we have somebody waiting in the closet, so to speak?
So, given that we can't do nothing with all these provocations, just there's other rogue regimes that's watching us. Sanctions is the only punitive thing that we got, and sanctions. People who are proponents of sanctions will argue that strong sanctions have not really been in place since February, March of last year. It's not right because you've heard this, that there are so many other countries that we sanction more heavily than North Korea. And so sanctions, they have not had real chance to succeed, particularly also because enforcement of sanctions have not been working. This is why we're trying to press China to enforce sanctions. Failing that, you will hear about the secondary sanctions against Chinese entities and banks that do illicit business with North Korea. So proponents of sanctions will say, let's give it a chance because it's the only option we've got in terms of trying to pressure the North Korean regime. There's no other option. So that's the only, given the limited options, this is the only thing we could possibly try. But my point is, after we try, and let's say we try to enforce sanctions and we try to do secondary sanctions, and none of this work, what are we going to do? And the regime change thing, and is that going to potentially destabilize? And if it does potentially destabilize the regime, is this the worst possible thing? I mean, I know this sounds really, it's not a popular thing to hear, but my personal view is that the North Korean state has to disappear. There's 25 million people we're not even talking about human rights. I mean, we haven't brought it up once, this whole conversation. But the ultimate solution to the Korean problem is for North Korean state to disappear and we have a unification. So far as having a destabilizing effect, that doesn't truly concern me. I know it has that creates a whole lot of other problems and we need to be prepared for that, but that's a whole separate conversation. In terms of regime change, I don't necessarily think, or I'm optimistic that we have a candidate and we can just make this magically occur. We don't, and Kim Jong-un is doing an excellent job getting rid of any potential person that could, look at how he just got rid of his half-brother, using WMD in a major international airport. But even for the regime change to occur, all the measures that we are talking about, whether it's sanctions or information campaign to get information into North Korea, all these other measures are of having that, it's contributing to that. And I'm just thinking that we need to be clear whether we want that as a goal or not. I'm not sure if our government has it as a goal, unification or regime change. It's something to think about, is what I'm saying. It's something that we need to just be really, face the hard truth and have it as a goal or not. But this is something that we need to discuss.
Thanks very much, Sue. Okay, a couple more. I'm going to go to the lady in the second row from the back, and then Mike Mosadig, 3 rows ahead of her.
Diane Perlman, Pacific Office Analysis, there's audio literature from the 80s that's not very well known now, and I think I know that the public service and talk about this before, and I think it's also problematic to say that there are no other options, and we have to only be pressure, and that there's a fair amount of evidence that holds that techniques have the opposite effect. There's one case, study of 100 cases of sanctions, and they looked at 14 times, like failed 86 times, so it's likely to produce the opposite effect. And sometimes, like Jervis and that we don't know about, when you get according to the sensor, you create dynamics that are all spiral theory and escalation, and that we need to do more tension reduction, and people more dangerous, more afraid, and rather like physically than psychic.
We're not catching all of this on the air, so just speed up a little bit here. Okay. Got it. And then 3 rows ahead.
Yeah, Mike Mosadig. Almost the flip side to what was said before. There was an article in the op-ed in the Outlook section of the Washington Post about 3 weeks ago by a person who was advertised in Chinese investment banker, but it could have been Henry Kissinger in disguise, suggesting that the deal we need to make is no regime change and a freeze on the nuclear program, which gets you away from the Gaddafi problem. Is there any future in that? Because so far, from everything I've heard today, it's been an inadvertent advertisement for strategic patience, which some people interpret as not doing much of anything. So is even this avenue a possibility?
Okay, thanks, Mike. So the first question was posed by Diane Perlman from George Mason University, who mentioned the literature in the 1980s, which reached the conclusion that coercive techniques can have the opposite impact, and that 14 of 100 cases of sanctions actually worked, meaning 86% did not work. And then Mike Musadik asked the question about basically the freeze, one variation of a freeze option of freezing on the nuclear program in exchange for clarity about no regime change, all of which sounds a bit like the strategic patience policy, which has been disavowed. So I guess this is more a question. The first one, Diane's question, is to Victor or Sue, whichever would like to take it up.
Yes, Victor. So then I would like to say a few words after Victor.
So it's a debate, right? I think it's a debate. I mean, there are people who say, in terms of sanctions, sanctions don't work until they do, right? I mean, you look at any sanctions case, and people will say, "Oh, they don't work," and then all of a sudden the target state does what you want, and they go, "Oh, it worked," but then they blame it on they have some other cause, right? Some alternative explanation. So the thing to remember about sanctions is that they don't work until they do. The other thing is that there is, I think, in the minds of many in the policy community, as a result of the Obama administration's policy, there is in the minds of many the model of Iran, right? And the view that, well, sanctions appear to have worked, whether you agree with it or not. There is a view out there that thinks sanctions and the sort of heavy sanctions that were placed on Iran, committed multilateral sanctions, worked to bring Iran to the table. Maybe something like that can happen with North Korea. This coincided with a number of studies that were done by think tanks here in Washington, as well as in South Korea, that put on paper to paper, compared the scope and breadth of Iran sanctions against North Korea sanctions, and saw it didn't even compare. I mean, North Korean sanctions were so minimal compared to what's been done on Iran. So there's that aspect, right? There's the other side of the debate that was referred to, which is, right, but this is 14 out of 100 cases they've worked. In addition to that, we've got, or we'll soon have, 2 aircraft carriers off the coast of the Korean Peninsula, right? We're in a sanctioning mode. North Korea is on a missile testing warpath, right? We have annual exercises coming up in August. No dialogue taking place. Historians will write about how this was a path to war, right? So there are 2 debates here, and there's no right or wrong, but that's what we're in the middle of right now in terms of the policy debate.
Thanks, Victor. Sue, you want to add to this?
Yeah, just quickly on the sanctions. Also, even if you're for engagement and for negotiation, sanctions we think that there's a leverage effect, right? Once you have heavy sanctions and then you have engagement, you have something to give away versus just going now, and why would North Korea ever give up anything? So there's that. In Iran, it took 3 years. In terms of the freeze question, I think we might, this is just so unpalatable, but we might have to get to those 2 options of either trying to deter, just deterrence and not try to talk to North Korea. As we live with nuclear Russia, nuclear China, we live with nuclear North Korea and just go into deterrence, and that's the end goal. Or it's not a goal, but this is what we might end up with. And or try to get the freeze deal. But both have a lot of problems. Even freezing has a lot of problems. Even the IC, we don't know what all the things are. It's not, some are over, but there are a lot of covert facilities with weapons. So how do we trust that they're going to do anything they say they're going to do? We had 20 years of working with them, and we had many, many deals with North Korea. Every single time the agreement fell apart, not because we didn't have an agreement, but over verification. So, there's a lot of concerns with both options.
We obviously need to go for another hour, but we've only got 5 minutes. Let's take 3 20-second questions. Right here. Okay, third row here. Yes, right here. Yes, you. Go ahead. Phrase your question. Go ahead.
Elleman, I'm a student. So my question is there a way to take the
Okay, good question. Right in back. Right in back. We're going to go lickety split. Yeah, go ahead. Blue tie guy.
So the question I have, Matthew Wong on American Security Project, with regards to a possible regime change or failure of regime or collapse of regime, even though that's unlikely, nobody thinks it's the Soviet Union, it's not either. Do we have, or should we be putting in plans or thinking about how to secure the nuclear program elements that are there, whose materials, missiles themselves, command and control, in case of regime?
Okay, and last question. Yes, gentleman in the second row. Okay, he's offering you. Go ahead,
So my
gentleman.
question, I'm Strategic Advisor from USC, regards their ability to use chemical and biological weapons, and I wanted to know, I guess, to what extent they have worked to develop those two types of weapons, and with which countries they might work with in the future to develop those capabilities so they can do it on their own.
Okay, good. We had three quick questions. One is there any way to take away the strategic leverage that North Korea provides to China so as to take that out of the equation? The second question was, if there is regime change, if the regime collapses, plans for securing the nuclear program. And lastly, question about chemical weapons capability. With whom might North Korea be working in the future, and how's that program going? So anybody want to address any one of those questions? They're not exactly in each person's specialty, but Mike, why don't you start?
Yeah.
And then use this as your summing up 30-second pitch.
On securing the nuclear weapons and other WMD missile technology in North Korea. Yes, there are elements within the Department of Defense that look at this very seriously. Whether we have the capability or not is a matter of argument. I've long argued that you need a group of experts in various fields, but the key is to wrap up the people, document the program, and then go after the assets. It's kind of the opposite of what we did with the Iraq Survey Group. But that is being worked, and I have a fair degree of confidence that we would succeed in securing at least the nuclear materials. On CW, VW, North Korea is a very opaque target. We don't know exactly what's going on. The presumption is they have the capacity to develop at least the chemical weapons. I would argue that chemical weapons they're not an effective battlefield weapon if your opponent is mobile and can be protected. And I would assume that the ROK forces and the U.S. forces there would have that capacity. Against civilian, cities and such, it could be rather disastrous. And because Seoul's within artillery range, you could deliver a lot of agent over a wide area to saturate it and kill large numbers of people. And that's what would be a major concern. Who's helping them? I think they have the capacity themselves to do these things. They may rely on certain chemicals that probably come over the border with China, because it's to even say it's leaky would be, I think, a generous description. It's as porous as a screen door. So I don't have a lot of confidence that it could be stopped.
Okay, thanks, Mike. We're going to just go down the row here. Professor Hwang.
Okay, I want to respond to the student question on the North Korea and China. So North Korea is not only the strategic asset for China, but also the strategic burden now. And also the China is a strategic asset for North Korea, and also the strategic burden, for the North Korea. So they need each other. That's why, China, does not, seems to us that China does not, cooperate enoughly, in the implementing the UN sanctions, because the Chinese, prefer the status quo of North Korea to the regime collapse, because it will destabilize the northeastern, Asia. And North Korea also, has some reservation about China, because China is not fully cooperating with North Korea either. But still, there is some, policy limitations, high end and low end. So they are moving, between these two. And so, maybe they try to maximize their own the strategic benefits. So right now it's very difficult to distinguish completely from the Chinese the benefit from the North Korea as well.
Okay, thanks, Jihwan. Sue.
I will answer in reverse order the questions. In terms of chemical weapons and biological weapons, North Korea definitely have robust chemical and biological weapons, and there's not enough attention paid to it. I think we need to, in addition to nuclear and missile program, and they do cooperate with countries like Syria on chemical weapons. Second question on securing nuclear arsenal, that is our number one concern. U.S.'s number one interest and concern if there's going to be an instability in North Korea. The problem is, while there are plans to try to secure, I think there's a lot of problems with it, like to get a lot of them are north of Pyongyang, the road conditions, trying to reach those places to secure it. If we don't go through the United Nations route, which will take months, it could be very protracted. The problem is, are we, the U.S. soldiers, going to run up all over North Korea in case of instability, and how China going to perceive that? So there's a lot of problems in trying to. There's been some challenges in trying to secure all the WMD in case of instability. In terms of China, North Korea, China always says no war, no instability, no nukes, and in that order. So I do think it's very difficult to get China to change its strategic calculus when it comes to North Korea, other than truly when China thinks there's actual war, threat of war, or maybe perhaps a threat of instability. But it will be very hard, and there will be a challenge for all of us to get China to change its thinking, to think that its interests will be better served without North Korea, aiding North Korea.
Thanks, Dr. Terry. And finally, Dr. Cha.
So 3 quick points. The first is Chinese policymakers, experts, they know all the arguments why they should drop North Korea. They know them all.
Right.
So that's my answer to your question. Right? Second, on actually, Mike had a question earlier about what if we just contain this problem, and mutual deterrence contain it. The only thing there is the horizontal proliferation problem, right? North Korea is a serial proliferator, right? We can go through the list, right? The Shahab missile is a North Korean missile. The Gowri missile is a North Korean missile. They sold a 5-megawatt reactor to Syria until the Israelis blew it up, right? They tried to sell to Iraq under Saddam Hussein, except Saddam Hussein wanted to pay on credit. He didn't want to pay on cash. Right? There's a whole list, right? And so they have sold every system they've ever developed. And in a containment scenario, I would be very worried about horizontal proliferation. And the last thing on sort of going after nukes in a unification scenario, again, I hate to throw data at you, but so we did a study where we actually surveyed experts, U.S. experts about this, and asked them what was the number one issue in a unification scenario in terms of the cross between priority and how much we knew, right? So the big blind spots are where you have high priority and we have no knowledge, right? Those are the big blind spots. And what we actually found surveying American experts was the number one issue was actually not WMD. The number one issue was domestic stabilization in North Korea. Not because we don't care about the nuclear issue, but I think relative to domestic stabilization, we feel like we know more about the WMD situation than we know about domestic stabilization in the North. So it was an interesting finding based on this data we did surveying 100 U.S. experts and government officials.
Well, thanks very much. This has been fantastic, if I may say so. I thought they were great presentations, very good questions, good answers. This has been the most overflow crowd we've ever had here. It's been the most heated discussion we've had here. And please join me in thanking the panelists, and come again.